welcome. Most of you know me. I'm Lisa Edstrom. I'm the faculty member of the Barnard Education Program. And we're going to get started. Tonight is our second of this semester's Barnard STEM Colloquium series. Tonight's presentation is offered through the Barnard Noyce Scholars Program funded by the National Science Foundation. The Barnard Noyce Scholars Program is a program run by the Barnard Education Program specifically to prepare teachers in STEM fields. Tonight we are fortunate enough to have Dr. Jennifer Adams here with us. Dr. Adams is an Associate Professor of Science Education at Brooklyn College and the CUNY Grad Center. Drawing on sociocultural frameworks, her research focuses on informal science learning with an emphasis on the places people learn science. In particular, she studies teacher education in partnership with museums, place-based science education, and community-based contextualized science learning interactions. Dr. Adams has worked as an educator and a researcher in New York City Public Schools and the American Museum of Natural History. She is currently a Center for the Advancement of Informal Science Education Fellow. Tonight, Dr. Adams presents findings from her qualitative study of the relationship between new teacher identity and classroom practice in regard to informal science education learning experiences in her talk entitled Place, Practice, and Identity, Portraits of Classroom-Based Informal Science Education for Meaningful Urban STEM Education. Let's welcome Dr. Adams.
Thank you for that nice introduction, and thank you everybody for having me here. So what I'm going to be talking about is the research that I'm doing. I received an NSF grant to do this research on teacher learning and identity in informal science institutions. And some of my research, and I'll talk to you about that because whenever you're doing research, things change in it. So I'll talk a little bit about some of those shifts that happened as I was doing this research on teacher learning. But just a little bit to set the context, situating. The reason why I've done this study is because recent literature have called more for like emerging, at least since maybe since 2010, 2011, and there was a report that came out of the government 2012 that really calls for making better connections between both formal and informal science learning, as a way both to improve science teaching and learning, to increase equity in science learning, and then also to create engaging science learning experiences. And also as a way of having, a lot of this initial research has been focused on youth and have a way of having young people able to engage in science both in very structured formal ways and in the classroom, and in more open-ended voluntary ways when they go into either a museum or a science center or a zoo or some kind of after-school context to learn science. So now I started to look at teacher learning because if we want to think about access to these informal science resources, often the teacher is a gateway for many students to have this type of access. Students' families, they will come across opportunities, but often teachers. And also, we started to see this, and when I say we, I'm talking about the field, as a way also to enhance both teacher learning and understanding of science content and how to engage in science, but also how to use resources outside of the classroom in their teaching. So research that connected informal science learning and teacher learning, found that informal science learning developed where teachers that learn in an informal science setting. And in the case of the first study, that was teachers that participated in facilitating a summer camp over the summer holiday, and they were more reform-minded teachers, so teachers that were more forward-thinking about science teaching and learning, and bringing different types of a variety or a range of experience rather than just like the test-oriented, because that's what. At the time, in 2007, that's what this more reform-oriented language refers to. Shows promises for for equity, so showing that these teachers that learned in informal science education, they had a more equity-minded teaching, or more looking at different resources that they can bring into the classroom so that all learners, whether you're thinking of it in terms of learning ability or you're thinking of it in terms of race and socioeconomic status and gender, that all learners would have the opportunity to engage in science. Another research found that teacher identities, they developed identities that mirror ISE practices. ISE practices usually lend itself to be more open-ended, inquiry-based, hands-on, student-centered, so they found that. And you know, the research that I did with my colleague at the American Museum of Natural History, we describe their learning as being student-centered and learner-responsive. So teachers who really strive to place the student at the center of the learning and not be the sage on the stage, and also being very responsive. So meeting the needs of the learners, both as these needs emerge, you know, in the act of teaching, and also thinking about these needs over the range, like in the planning of lesson plans and activities and things like that. So I started with these research questions, you know, in what ways does informal science learning influence science teacher identity, and in what ways teachers define, redefine, and enact informal science, and for what purposes. The second question kind of came a little bit later, and I'll explain a little bit more, but it became later because it kind of went beyond like, the teacher identities that mirror ISE practices. And in the research that I was doing, we were finding that, yes, there were aspects of it that mirrored practices, but there was a lot more to it than that. So in order to think again about you know, this notion of teacher learning and informal science, I went back to like the original definition, like what is informal science learning, just kind of a foundational thing. So you know, is it an association in the literature? Is it an association with a place, or is it an association with a practice? In the United States, where a lot of this initial informal science learning literature is coming from, we tend to describe it out of learning outside of the formal school structure, both the physical, like building of the school, and also the physical schedule of the school. So, you know, the physical structures that would be associated with the places down there, and then the schedule would be like after school, you know, or on the weekend learning. And it's often positioned in contrast or opposition to formal learning. So you will often find people talking about it like, oh, informal science learning is fun and it's engaging. Oh, classroom learning is so boring. And, you know, so there's always this like, this strong divide when people talk about informal and formal learning. So in 1982, researchers Mocker and Spears, they developed this kind of matrix that defined learning in terms of learning control and over the means and objective of the learning. And so, you know, these are some of the, this is the way that they were describing it. So for me, this provided like an initial language or an initial like foundation. So when people are saying, oh, well, what is formal, what is informal, or when my teachers are talking about formal, informal, this is just kind of something to bounce that, or to, you know, to bounce that off of. So formal learning, learner decides neither learning objectives or approach. That largely describes like, you know, classroom K through 12. We could even say, yeah, university degree program certification. So you're going in there, somebody has pre-decided what you're going to learn, and for the most part, how you're going to learn it. Informal learning, these objectives are predetermined. However, how you as a learner approach it is, you know, how you choose to approach it. So this does describe a lot of the visitor experiences, like in informal science places. Like if you go to a museum, there is an exhibit there. The exhibit was designed with certain objectives in mind, learning objectives in mind, that are like, you know, and I could speak for the American Museum of Natural History because I worked there for a number of years. So, you know, if they have, you know, an exhibit on germs, for example, it's going to maybe have some type of objectives that the curators decided that they wanted you to learn. The educators are going to develop lesson plans based on those objectives, but you as a learner that come in there, you know, if you're coming in there on a Saturday, you may walk through and you may decide, you know, oh, you're going to focus on just this one aspect of it. So you may not learn, quote unquote, all the rest of it. Or you may just walk through and look at the pictures and you may learn something totally different that was unintended in the original, you know, the original plan of the exhibit. Now when we go to non-formal, this is when the learner determines both the learning objectives and the approach. So this is a type of learning that happens like through everyday conversations. This is more related to like more learning communities that happen around that. So in looking at these three definitions, if we go to the next one, that it is a continuum, that there are elements of this in all learning contexts. So if you even think about the classroom, there's going to be elements of that in your classroom. So for example, you have a lesson plan and you have certain objectives. Maybe you have some students that, you know, worst case scenario, that might have tuned out, so they're not going to learn it, or they may learn it in an informal way, maybe through a conversation with their colleague that they're having, you know, sitting next to them. And I chose this picture as an example of this because this was a field experience that my students at Brooklyn College went on in Barbuda, because we have a field school down there, and they were these were all like, well, these two are my teachers from Brooklyn, and these two were another professor's teachers. I forgot what state they were from. I think it was from Nebraska. And so it was a whole field school about sustainability. So there were definitely goals and objectives that we had, that we wanted them to learn as educators. There were also goals and objectives because they were part of a larger community of students with different majors and things like that. But in this conversation, it was, you know, more, I guess, informal, non-formal, because they're engaging with the gentleman with the hat on. He's a teacher from Barbuda, and he's a marine biologist also, and he is, they were doing something there where they were taking seedlings out that they were then going to plant at the research station. And so while they're doing this activity, they're also learning about this activity, but then they're having these conversations about him teaching his students, them teaching their students. They're asking him questions about how can, because he's a more experienced teacher, they're newer teachers, so they're asking him questions about teaching and learning. So there is this, both this formal and informal and non-formal learning all happening at the same time. Okay, so going to more of a theory and how I approach the research, and I won't spend a whole lot of time on this unless people have questions about it. We, you know, when you approach a research, you try to think about like what framework you're going to use to help to understand, you know, things like learning and thinking about identity as learning. So I started with an initial definition of teacher identity as looking at the way a teacher represents herself through practices and positioning. And then talking about how a teacher develops an identity both in relation to the learning context and interaction with each others, through learning, through you know, becoming self-confident in practices. One develops agency, so the belief in self-ability, you know, and being able to access and appropriate those you know, appropriate resources. And since this was really shaped around informal science education as a resource, I really wanted to look at how teachers shape this identity around being able to access and appropriate informal science types of resources in their classroom. But then I started to shift with my research group, because we started to think about teacher identity not only in relation to where they learn to teach, but more so in relation to their students, in relation to the context that they teach, and in ongoing dialogues that I was having with the teachers. And you'll see what the research procedure, I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, that we were finding that a lot of issues of, like, you know, race and ability and you know, and class and gender, that were all coming up in these discussions, and those were very salient in how the teachers taught, you know, both in their own identities, their own gendered, racialized, and ability identities, and their own students' racialized and ability identities. So it was more complicated than just them coming into this classroom context and having a relationship with it and learning how to teach. So we started to look at more post-structural notions of identity, where framing identity more as this stable thing, and stable does not mean unchanging. It just means that it's something that changes more slowly and over time, thinking about it more as a slow evolution. Whereas subjectivity is that aspect of identity that's constantly shifting and responding to the context that there's there. Because in a teacher's life, there's always going to be these shifts that are constantly happening, both with individual students, with the content that you're trying to teach, with the entire class as a whole. So there's all of these constantly shifting things. And these things are often, they're socially constructed, and they're contested, and they're constantly being made and remade, because those are the issues, like, and even a new teacher does not yet have an identity as a teacher, but it's rather that subjectivity, because it's that shift about like, oh, well, I'm supposed to be a teacher, and this is how a teacher is defined, but that's not a definition that I necessarily contributed to. So how am I going to shape myself around this identity that I didn't necessarily make? And it's the same thing with race and gender and things like that. But as a teacher forms a teaching identity over time, it becomes more stable when that person can say, this is who I am as a teacher, this is how I teach, and this is how I relate to my students. And it becomes stabilized, but it's still subjected to the things that constantly happen and those shifts that happen in the classroom. Why am I pointing in this direction? It's over here. Okay. So now just talking about, now going back to the context and kind of going back a little bit to the, the beginning of the research. The teachers that I invited to participate in the research, these are all teachers for the most part. Most of them have graduated from Brooklyn College, because we have like a very embedded place-based informal science education type of philosophy and approach in a lot of the classes. So there was a whole MAT Earth Science program that was redesigned with informal science learning as central to it. So these are the courses that they took. The Trust course, that's in collaboration with the American Museum of Natural History. It's a 2-week class that happens every summer, where where teachers are immersed in the museum, and they get to learn with scientists and museum educators, both about using the museum resources, also about how to use place-based resources, learning science content and everything. And then there was also a whole selection of online courses that were designed in collaboration with the museum. And this does require students, or teachers who are most part students, going out into the field in their communities or wherever they are and collecting their own data and observations and things and bringing them back into the classroom. Okay, so the research approach, I like to use dialogic methodology, so that means that where there is this interaction that's happening. So it's more than just going in and interviewing people and getting data, but having like these ongoing dialogues, or even if it is a one-time interview, we designed a series of dialogic interviews where these questions were more open-ended and designed to spark some type of exchange with the researcher and the person who was being interviewed. So one of the we have about like 20, 25 people that we individually interview, but I also have a group of about like 7 teachers who are all new teachers. They've been with me now for about 2 years, so they're all within their first like 1 to 3 years of practice. And we meet every other week, and we really talk about informal science learning in the classroom. And sometimes, and many times, the discussion doesn't necessarily focus on informal science learning, but it's open up to science teaching and learning in general. They bring in artifacts from their teaching, so that's like lesson plans, student work, pictures, whatever they want to bring in. Sometimes they send me text, YouTube videos, things like that. And I documented how they talk about their learning, how they talk about their teaching, how they talk about their students, and really use a grounded theory approach. And that's where I started to shift and change like both my questions and changing how I think about, or started to think about, identity, just from using that to know that I'm not going to be necessarily starting and ending with the same, the same conceptions that I have about teaching, learning, and identity. So I did, what I would call is open coding, and I'm working with my research team on this now. I mean, it's an ongoing process. It started with the beginning of the research to think about, like, well, what is it that I am learning, and what does this mean about teaching, and what are some different ways that, or some different lens that I can look at and examine this. And then more like where I am right now is like applying. I mean, we did some of the restoring, which is what I'm going to talk about today, but then doing the applying analytic questions to the data is where I'm at with my group now, where we started to look at some of these different themes that emerge, and now we're going back where we're looking at theory and then using that theory to go back to the data with questions. Okay, so some of the things like from the restoring part of it, defining ISE. As I said before, the teachers, I started with those initial conceptions of what is informal science, and we found that teachers were defining them in very different ways. However, there were commonalities in how they described informal science learning. So they always described it in terms of motivating and energizing student learning, and that probably goes back to that dichotomy that I mentioned before between like informal science, fun and exciting, classroom, boring. So they always talked about it as a way of motivating and energizing student. They describe different activities or spaces in the classroom in terms of informal and formal. So this was like when I first started to realize that for them it went beyond field trips, because not all teachers are able to take field trips for whatever reasons. For whatever reasons, and usually it has to do with like the school administrative structures. So what they started to do was to think about, this is an informal type of activity, or this is a space in my classroom that I developed to be more of an informal space. And they describe this in terms of teacher power and student agency and choice. So the spaces that were considered informal, that's the space where I, as a teacher, I step back and I let students do what they want to do with the content in the space, or I create these types of activities, and then students have a choice of which activities they want to do. So there was this definitely, teachers were very deliberate about saying, oh, this is informal and this is formal, and how they defined it was definitely related to how they saw themselves, in terms of power in relation to the student learning, either in that space or in that moment. So in the teacher's eyes, there was, even though it was defined, it was this blurry boundary. It was kind of fluid, where depending on what they were planning and how it happened, it can happen like in a, you can go from a lecture and then you can go into an informal science space and then back into a more formal space. And there are some things that I feel that I have to teach them, and then there are other things that once they have this, then they can go back into the informal space. So it was this very, and maybe I should change that blurry to be more of a fluid boundary between the spaces. So now I just wanted to describe some of the portraits of some of the teachers that have been a part of this group. So this one I call the striver. And these were meant to be, like portraits, or what one of my the teacher researchers, he kind of described them. What are those, the major arcana of the tarot card? There was a word that he described them, but to use to describe these different teachers, because he was like, oh yeah, you made up these, not caricatures, the word will come to me. But anyway, this teacher, he came from a very didactic teaching background, where it was all like rote memory, teacher in front of the class, recitation all the way. So for him, he wanted the learning to be spontaneous. So he would describe informal science learning as, being the spontaneous thing, because he saw this as a way of getting his students excited and wanting to be lifelong learners in the classroom. So he worked hard to develop like these different activities, and here students were doing something with bridges and pennies and seeing if they could, who can build a bridge that would hold the most pennies. So for him, this was informal. So he was teaching about some physical science concepts, but then developed this activity. He did his whole like lecture and recitation thing, but then developed this activity that he called the informal activity, so that they had a chance to engage with the concepts by using these types of hands-on and dialogic ways. And he strived to be more informal through hands-on activities and student choice. So this was something that he worked towards. And then I have what I call the orchestrator. Now, he self-identifies as having a learning disability. He self-identifies as having, high-functioning autism. And he really was about creating these different spaces where students can engage in their own ways and at their own pace. Because he had a mixed abilities classroom. So he really wanted to make sure that all of his students had a chance to learn, but he paid more careful attention to those students who were more of the diverse learners, because he felt that they were not, they did not thrive in the types of traditional classroom environments. And speaking from his own experience, he felt that he knew that he learned best in these kinds of more informal ways and where he had choice. So he tried his best to develop that for his students. And then he also had, as I said, these spaces, or he would do these things like where it was time for them to review. So he would allow students to use whiteboard markers to write on the windows. He painted one desk with with chalkboard paint, so students can use that to draw out things while they were thinking about it. And he actually moved from a school, because he moved up to Yonkers, and he moved from a school in the Bronx to Yonkers, and the first thing that he did was that he went and he painted the tables again, so he can begin to recreate some of that space that he had in his old school in his new school. So for him too, he was very methodological. He was very thought everything, whereas the striver, he was more like, oh, I'm going to do this lesson plan, but then I'm going to have them do this activity to learn it. Chris was more about I didn't mean to say his name, but anyways, a lot of Chris's out there, but he was more about I'm going to create these types of structures and I'm going to plan this out so that they have these particular activities that they can engage in with this ways. He really spent a lot of time and a lot of energy into planning. Not to say that the striver didn't spend time, but Chris was just very much he had his way of doing it. The advocate. This is a teacher who, she's in a school where the students have similar racialized and socioeconomic backgrounds that she has. And she views science, whenever she talks about science and informal science, it was always about the experiences and exposing students to different experiences and allowing them to have these different experiences. So she would do in the classroom, she still did her hands-on things, and she emphasized that a lot, but she was really about taking them out of the classroom, and not only to the museums and stuff, but for example, she took them up to Rockefeller Center when they have science. They had some science Saturdays up there. She took them to Medgar Evers College, which is not far from her high school, because they had some kind of environmental science day there. So she tries to expose them as much as she can to these different places where they can see science in different ways. And the remarkable thing that at least I think is remarkable, is that she does this on her own time, because there is not enough time within the school, the school structure for her to have these types of field trips. And then the principal, he's all like, if you have a field trip, then we have to get coverages and everything like that. So it becomes a big deal. So rather than that, she uses her own time on the weekend to take these students out on field trips. So now, her struggle is because she really wants to get the parents more involved, because she's in a school that emphasizes math and ELA. When there is something around math and ELA, the parents will come out in droves. But when there's something around science, she says she may get one or two if she's lucky. So one of the things in the group that she's trying to figure out is how can she get the parents to be more involved with both coming up to the school when she has these science nights, but then also to be engaged on taking these kids on field trips on the weekends. Another one that was totally, to me, off the box, way different than what I was thinking, is this one is a career manager. And one of my researchers, she's she's a doctoral student, and she was the one that was saying, well, maybe the reason why it's been so hard to think about his perspective is because he's in a school that's very different. He's in a very career-oriented school that focuses on giving kids both the skills and content that they need to pursue marine-related careers. And he himself was a naval, coming out of the Navy, so coming out of a naval career. So a lot of his talk was about workforce development. But when he talked about workforce development, he always talked about these informal activities, these hands-on activities that would get the students engaged and learn these workforce skills. But he always talked about it in terms of informal because he was connecting that with the hands-on bit. But then, you know, because he doesn't have a direct curriculum to follow, it made it a little bit harder to analyze. And he also talked a lot about these spontaneous and unexpected learning. Like one time, I guess a fisherman brought a giant squid into the classroom and they dissected it. So to him that was informal because it was this unexpected thing that happened in his classroom. So, so those are just four of, you know, and there's a couple more that I have in my group. So in general, the informal science takes on different meanings for these teachers, and that depends on, you know, both their subjectivities in relation to their students, because a lot of them were looking at the different skills and techniques and things that their students do. So, and they played out in the lives of teachers. They don't fall very neatly into this matrix. Their subjectivities, both like with their own who they were and their growing identities as teachers, this allowed them to enact ISE in very different ways. So yes, there was that common hands-on thing. Yes, there was that common student-centered thing. But as you can see in those four teachers that I presented, they were all enacted in very different ways. So research approach, the one with them coming into this group, that also supplied a source of support. And in general, there's been research that shows that when teachers have a space that they can come and talk about their teaching with other teachers and get ideas, it's also a source of support. So a lot of the teachers that are in this group, now when they go back, they use like the whiteboard markers on the windows in order to get their kids to review for things. And they share and they use ideas from each other in their classroom and bring them back into the group. So in thinking about teacher learning, and thinking about informal science education, rather than not only teaching them about how to use this institution, but how to bring some of that praxis of using, you know, these types of resources back into their classroom to create equitable teaching learning environments. So maybe in like a museum context, rather than having a reflection on just the content itself, maybe having more of a reflection on the learners that would be learning this content. So what is it like for you to learn this content? Having a discussion with other teachers that you're in this professional learning group with. What is it like for them to learn this content? Being able to observe, you know, other both students like in classes or the general public observing, and then trying to discern from your observations, what is it like for this learner to learn this content? And, you know, so that goes like to the second point, like move away from teaching teachers how to use, teaching them how to adapt resources. So rather than like, here is a lesson plan and here's a resource, thinking about, look at this lesson plan, look at this resource, what are some ways that you think you might adjust this to meet the needs of your learners in the room? And then having them in like a workshop or something, being able to share that out with other teachers so that they're not doing that kind of planning in a vacuum, but they're getting, you know, suggestions from other teachers that could be useful. And this is important to learning what teachers need in order to support creative practices in the classroom and a creative integration of ISE. And I'm using that word creative just to think more broadly about what is ISE, what does this mean for the teachers, and how, like for what purposes are they using it for and how are they using it. Okay, so moving forward, with the research group that I'm with now, we're going back into the data, both the individual interviews and the group data, and some of the questions that have emerged from the other, like there's 2 doctoral students and a postdoc in the group, and looking at teachers' self-perceptions as learners in relation to their teaching identities. So what is it about them and how they perceive themselves as learners? Because in some of the interviews it came up with like, you know, I learn best this way. I learn best with this kind of way. And in looking at, in going back at that, we found that the teachers in the ways that they learn, they seem to design their lesson plans around that way. And it was almost like the informal science experiences allowed them to become more self-reflective about the way that they learn. And I definitely saw that with the one that had the learning, that self-identified with the learning disabledness, and then being able to create these types of experiences for his learners. Another one that came out, in which several of us are looking at, is the racialized storylines and how that plays out in a science classroom. Like, what are the perceptions of who can learn science, both in terms of the teacher, you know, being a teacher of color, students of colors, because there is a perception that students of color can't learn science, especially students of color who happen to be in like an ICT class, or they're unable to learn science, or they don't need to learn science because they're not going to be scientists, you know, so there's that notion that comes out. So that's something that we want to look at, is like, what is the racialized storylines of, you know, science, and how it plays out in the classroom with teachers, and how do they either like take up, refuse, or transforms these storylines for their students. And so discourses and what we call like desiring silences, that's a way of maintaining the status quo. Like, how do, you know, teachers, and it kind of, you know, relates to both of them, but with the dominant ideologies about STEM, because it could be both about the learners, but then it also could be about like the national or local rhetoric about STEM, and creating a STEM, you know, innovative, entrepreneurial STEM workforce. And, you know, a lot of my group are interested in looking at how neoliberalism influences education. So how does neoliberalism influence this type of discourse, and how, again, do teachers either take up, refuse, or change this discourse in their classroom? So that's where we're kind of at now. And yeah, so that's it. And if anybody has any questions, I'd be more than happy to ask them. And I also saw that you were reading a couple of my articles, so if you have questions about that, even though I, you know, wrote them a while ago, so I'd have to like go back into the mental archive, you know. Yeah. You're welcome. I can ramble through that. Yes.
This matrix stuff that we're going to be came up with, but it's sort of it's like a binary between like whether or not students control the approach and the learning objectives. So I noticed that there's one missing, I guess, in this theory, which is like where the approach is defined by the teacher and the like learning objectives are like not defined by the teacher, they're like under the student's control. Is that something that's like realistic or worth studying?
I don't know, give an example of that, like.
So like.
Or is it something you're thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, it is something that I'm thinking about.
Oh, okay.
Like, for example, like you give a student a telescope and you like tell them how to like instruct them how to use it, but then you don't tell them what to look at through that telescope. Like, does that work?
Yeah, I mean, that definitely works. And I mean, you know, and again, I just presented this because this is where I went back to in order to define it. But then, you know, going back to this, there are aspects of that, because yes, there may be the formal aspect of this is how you use, you know, just like when you use the microscope too, this is how you use a microscope. But now that you know how to use a microscope, it goes to like, you know, to non-formal. Like I'm going to go and look at fabric, you know, or I'm going to go and, you know, look at, or a telescope, you know, I may decide to look at the stars, or I may decide to see if I can look at New Jersey, you know, something like that. So it's a, you know, it's that. So, but I do find that when we do have these types of definitions, that people do get caught up into like trying to fit things into these little boxes. And what I did want to show is that with the teachers, because I never showed them any of these definitions, you know, is that how they did the informal science learning, or how they did teaching and learning in general, it did not fit into any of these boxes, but it was, you know, it was all over, you know, sometimes it had more elements of this, and other times it had more elements of that, but it was very different.
I'm curious if from your, you know, your perspective from working with the museum, but also from working with teachers, if you have ideas of like best practices for engaging students in either a
usually like the best way, which is not always like the most, I should say, the most feasible way, is giving them open-ended choice, where they can go in, they can choose what they want to learn, how they want to learn it, how they want to engage it. So now stepping it back a bit is being able to give some elements of choice, some elements of choice either in what they want to learn or how they want to learn it. And so it would be up to the teacher or the professional development person in that matter to figure out like what are the ultimate objectives, like what is it that you want people to learn, but what are the different paths that people can take in order to learn that objective. And that's what one of my teacher, the one that I called the orchestrator, that's what he kind of did, is where he figured out, this is where he wanted to be, at the end of this unit, and these are the different ways that his students can get there. These are the different activities, the types of activities that they can learn and do that. So, as a teacher, it's always important to, to have an end goal about what you want people to come away with, and then plan from there. I mean, they call that the backwards planning. But then think about, there can either be one path as a teacher that you decide, or there can be multiple paths. And it takes time too, because as a new teacher, it's about building up that toolbox, because maybe you will start off with that one path, and then you may go to professional development, and you may learn a different one, and then you may have these two, and then you may be able to adapt them to different ways, and then you come out with 4. So it's, it takes, time to learn different ways of practicing so that you're able to get to that goal, whatever it is.
I'm curious. So towards the end, you were talking about the racialized storylines of science, and I know this is future work, but I'm wondering, you talked about one teacher who identified similarly to her students. For the most part, was that atypical within your research, or typical? Like, did most of the teachers?
Most of my teachers identified with their students somehow. What the case where I got the racialized storylines, because there are 3 teachers in particular, and they're 3 females of African descent. One of them is, Afro-Caribbean, and 2 are African American. And 2 of them teach in schools that have students of predominantly African American descent. One teaches in a school that is more diverse, but doesn't have as many students of African descent. It's more of a upper middle class school. And I noticed that in the research that they often talked about themselves vis-a-vis their students, like as both like identifying as like, I'm a black person, and this is what I want from my black students, because I know that this is the discourse around STEM surrounding them, and so this is what I'm going to do to help to change that discourse for them. But again, the 3 of them did it in very, very different ways. For example, like the one that I spoke about here, it was her about taking them out and having experiences with them. Another one, she has kind of 2 spaces where she does that. In her school, she has an issue with students that have to repeat science often because they didn't do well in science. So she feels like she's become more of this coach, and where she's like constantly telling them like, you can do this, because I don't want to see you next year, and you can do this, and trying to engage them. But then she also has this library program, because she know that her students, in the class, they weren't coming with these strong science skills that enabled them to pass the Regents the first time. So her way of doing that is by getting them young in this informal library program that she self-funded and everything, and what she called it, Enhanced Thoughts, where, she has these hands-on activities that they do. I think she does it like once a month at the library, and she sees that as a way of strengthening the same, racial demographic groups of students, so that when they get to that point, that she's hoping that they will have the skills and content, that they need. So that's where so she's doing that in order to help this, but still at the same time like trying to massage and coach and get these students to pass this exam, you know. And then the other one, she's in the more affluent school that doesn't have as many students of color. She's always questioning how she's relating to those students of color in her class, because she's knowing, oh, they don't raise their hands as much. And I know that I'm hard because I'm always going over there and like, I know you know this and I know you can do this, and I'm wondering if I'm hard on myself, you know. So that's where I started to look at all, you know, these three students, these three teachers in particular, and to really see how they, like, you know, again, how are they responding to or taking up or relating to this discourse, and what does it mean for them around being black in relation to science, you know? So that's where that whole notion. So I've begun to look back, because it's a matter of going back and looking at the transcripts of when they were speaking about that. So I've begun to look back at some of those transcripts and really try, you know, to analyze like what's happening in those conversations for them.
I'm wondering if do you have any intention of sort of looking at the flip side, looking at the other teachers who are not black and seeing how they're thinking about
I
race in the
will,
classroom?
but I have like, cause yeah, most of the, trying to think, cause there's Chris, and he identifies as Latino, but he's more identified, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say his name, but he more identifies with his like learning disability and being as a general like urban student. Then there is another young lady, and she's white, but she's only started coming to the research group. So I haven't been able to. And then there's another older gentleman, and he's also Latino, but he really doesn't talk about like the racial ethnic structures. He's more talking about like the work and workforce, even though he does talk about it in terms of like, we want our New York City kids to have these jobs and not people coming from Vermont to take them, you know. So he's all about, and that's probably where that discourse would be, you know, I would interpret it to mean that, you know, it's not him saying that, but I would interpret it to mean that, so that the students, because, you know, a lot of, I guess, the higher paying jobs in the harbor, they tend to go to students from outside the city who tend to be more male and more white. And the students that are from the city, they tend to get more of the lower paying jobs. So he's really wanting to see his students get those higher paying jobs, you know? So that's where I would interpret it as being that. And, you know, and then like, you know, like a lot of research groups, you have a core that comes all the time, and then you have the drips that come in and out. And so, you know, and the other ones that come in and out, they're different, you know, racial groups. So yeah, so I haven't been able to really get a deep, you know, even thinking about them.
I'm just curious, as I'm thinking about the students that we have here who are working towards becoming teachers, and how we've got students of all races grappling with the racialized experiences in the classroom from all different angles. And I was just wondering
Yeah.
what insight you have.
Yeah, because I guess I haven't seen much in the literature, at least in science, about teachers of color and dealing with students of color and having to deal with that, you know, that discourse that happens. So it's just, so that's another reason why I know from myself and my research group, that's been very important for us to really look at that.
Yeah, it does seem to be avoidable.
Yeah.
Any other questions?